So, with this lecture, we now move to East Asia, more specifically China. And we're kind of, as is often the case with History 116, we're kind of picking up where we left off with History 115. And of course, I'll try to keep that in mind as we move forward. The period we're looking at, running from roughly the middle of the 14th century up to the beginning of the 20th century, and will be dominated by two different dynasties. The first, the Ming dynasty, running from 1368 until 1644. You'll see I have indicated there that it is a Chinese dynasty. What I really mean by that is from an ethnic standpoint, in terms of who during this period would have been viewed as being ethnically Chinese. They pretty much fit the bill. So already there's kind of emerging this idea that individuals residing in territory that had been under rule by the Han Dynasty, very often referred to as Han Chinese, are somehow more purely Chinese in an ethnic sense. And then we have the Qing Dynasty running from 1644 to 1911. And this is going to be a period of territorial expansion of China, wherein large numbers of people who are not viewed as being Han Chinese in an ethnic sense are going to be incorporated into the Chinese Empire. And that would include, in fact, the ruling dynasty, which ethnically would probably be best to define them as being Manchu. And this certainly is kind of how they saw themselves, right? They saw themselves as somehow being distinct in an ethnic sense. And they would also, in an effort to ensure that they had kind of political control, would maintain themselves within a high position, not just politically, but also with respect to the military. So sometimes we say also a dynasty of conquest, reflective of this kind of expansion of territory being brought under Chinese rule. Now, this period is also going to be a period of tremendous economic growth, and also kind of going to witness a transition from a kind of more agriculturally based economy to one much more rooted in commercial activity, trade, and so forth. It might surprise some people to realize that prior to the Industrial Revolution, probably the two most important countries with respect to global trade were China and India. India, and we're not really looking at India very closely right now, but India would actually, up until the Industrial Revolution, be the biggest producer of textiles in the world. And that might surprise some people. Eventually, they'll be replaced by the British, who, after they colonize India, will pretty much shut down textile production there. And kind of force India to shift to a economy based on the production of cash crops to be shipped to England and then turned into manufactured textile goods, which then would be sold in India. So that's kind of another story. In China, in connection with this kind of transition from kind of being more agriculturally based to being more active in trade and commerce, we're going to see a number of other kinds of developments, and this is actually very often how this kind of thing happens. Very often it begins with increased agricultural production that leads to population growth, and then a significant percentage of the population no longer being needed for food production and becoming much more active in other kinds of activities, right? So as of 1368, China's population was already growing. It was up to 70 million, will continue to grow up through the 18th century. And a lot of this stemming from increased agricultural production, some of which reflects agricultural innovations, where they're developing new technologies and techniques that are allowing for more productive crops. But also the introduction of new crops, some coming from the New World, that are going to flourish in China. So here, for instance, you see corn being grown, and of course corn coming from the Americas. Now, alongside this growth in population, we're also going to see some population shifts away from the center to parts of China that up until then were somewhat sparsely populated, particularly in the north. But also the south and southwest of China are going to see an influx of migrants coming from the very densely populated center of China, the lower Yangzi region. And we're going to see Chinese beginning to migrate further afield, some of them going over to Taiwan, which eventually, well, this is actually something contested today, that mainland China claims that Taiwan has always been and should continue to remain part of a unified China. Of course, today Taiwan has its own government, but in a sense, this this kind of relates to the kind of historical development we're looking at here. We're also going to see a lot of Chinese settling in mercantile communities in Southeast Asia, right? So this is kind of part of the beginning of a network of trade that's going to cover much of Asia and even to some degree further afield. Where you have these very important Chinese communities that are beginning to develop in different parts of the world, particularly Southeast Asia, where even today they continue to constitute very sizable minority populations within many of the corresponding countries in that part of the world. So here we have a map that hopefully gives you kind of an idea of that prior to these population shifts, what's kind of colored there in dark orange, but also yellow, kind of corresponding to what constituted the Chinese Empire at the beginning of the period we're looking at, right? And so the people residing within that particular, those particular territories, coming to constitute individuals generally perceived later on as being purely Chinese in an ethnic sense, right? And then a lot of the territories that we see colored in green there will eventually be brought into the Chinese Empire. And to some degree, the peoples inhabiting those regions will, from an ethnic standpoint, be perceived as, in some regards, not being purely Chinese. We might make note of the fact also that with these population shifts, they don't always happen peacefully. Very often people moving into a new region might come into conflict with whoever was already there. This can be a consequence of a number of different factors, including just simple competition for whatever resources are available there. One really notable example of this would be the Maya Wars of the late 18th century, a consequence of the movement of Chinese settlers into the southwestern uplands. And we should also note that even as people are moving away from the center, the population there is going to continue to grow. I mean, in fact, that is kind of the major factor causing people to leave, right? As population is growing, really only a certain number of people can subsist in that particular region, so they end up being in some ways forcibly displaced, right? But the Yangzi basin is going to become even more densely populated. It's going to remain primarily a agricultural center, kind of the main source of food production in China, often referred to as the rice basket of China. Though we are going to see at some point a shift away from growing crops for the sake of providing food to the cultivation of cash crops such as silk and cotton. And this is kind of tying into China's growing commercialization, right? So the agriculture becomes tied into that. And just to be sure, we know what part of China we're talking about when we refer to the Yangtze Basin. This map should give a pretty clear indication. And as you can see, it's quite central to China, geographically speaking, even today. So all of these developments coming together to constitute what is often referred to as China's third commercial revolution, roughly covering the years from 1500 to 1800. So, really getting underway during the mid-16th century with the growth of commerce. And we should note there are other factors underlying this kind of commercial revolution. Some of it reflects changes in government policy, the elimination of stifling monopolies and other restrictive government policies. So, what from a modern day American viewpoint we might see as a kind of more capitalistic approach where government is taking on a smaller role with respect to the economy. But in any event, by the early 19th century, China was probably the most highly commercialized non-industrial society in the world. So as the Chinese become much more active with respect to commercial activities and trade, we're going to see the emergence of a kind of single currency based on silver. And this is going to greatly facilitate the ability of people to engage in these kinds of activities. Now, one very important stimulus for this is going to be the importing of silver from mines in Japan, but also coming from the Americas with Spanish galleons that are sailing from Acapulco to China. Eventually, the Chinese are going to open up their own silver mines, for instance, in Guizhou and Yunnan provinces, right? But this is one of those kinds of developments that feeds back into itself, right? I mean, this kind of growing access to silver is going to greatly facilitate the development of currency, and as people start to use currency in order to conduct trade and other kinds of commercial activity, that's going to increase the demand for silver. And that kind of underlies, for instance, the development of silver mines in China. And related to this, we're going to see the development of banking, right? Particularly as represented by a network of banks under the Yangzi. All of this facilitates the transfer of funds from one area to another, the ability to extend credit for trade, and so forth. And related to this, eventually a very important kind of government reform with respect to taxation, the consolidation of many different taxes into a single tax payable in silver. So up through the 16th century, if you were, someone living in China, you had about 30 to 40 different taxes that you would have to pay, and you would have to pay them in different ways. In some cases, you'd have to pay them in grain. In other cases, through labor service, and sometimes, you might pay the tax in cash. So imagine this would have really set some pretty heavy restrictions or limitations in terms of the kind of economic decisions you might make. You would have to ensure that you were producing a sufficient amount of grain to pay some taxes. You would have to allocate some of your labor in order to pay other taxes and so forth. So, kind of limited flexibility in terms of what you might do, the kind of economic decisions you might make. This is going to be consolidated with what's known as the single whip reform into one tax payable in silver. And this is going to allow for a much greater degree of flexibility as far as the kind of economic decisions you might make and the kind of economic activities you might engage in. So, for instance, farmers who obtain silver in the market by selling their grain, they can maybe use some of that silver to pay the tax, but then they might use whatever additional silver they have in order to engage in other kinds of activities, right? They might eventually switch over entirely to cash crops. They don't have to actually worry about, producing a particular grain in order to pay a particular tax. That would be a good example of the kind of flexibility they might enjoy. And so this can also be seen as reflective of the government adopting a more, the term we often use today, laissez-faire approach with respect to the economy, right? Where different individuals are making their own decisions. And in this case, it does lead to greater economic growth. Now, as far as who's benefiting from this economic growth, certainly the larger cities are benefiting from it, but probably the most notable impact is going to be with respect to intermediate market towns, which provide the link between the local markets and the larger provincial capitals and cities such as Beijing. And part of this reflects the importance of inter-regional trade, which is probably the dominant form of trade during this period. You do have international trade, and you also have purely regional trade. But inter-regional trade is probably the most dominant element, considering that the Chinese empire is quite large. So you're going to see goods moving from one part of China to another. And with inter-regional trade, we're primarily talking about luxury goods such as silk, lacquerware, and porcelain. Related to this, we're going to see some other economic developments that are worth noting. For instance, the development of what in Europe would be called the cottage industry, a kind of putting out system in textiles. which is a bit more capitalistic. It's kind of the idea that an individual with sufficient capital would basically provide raw materials to workers who would then work within their homes, hence the term cottage. And then the one investing in this kind of economic activity would then show up a bit later to collect the textiles they produced and then sell it for profit, right? So kind of the idea that you have someone who has the capital, the so-called capitalist, who organizes and finances each stage of production from raw fiber to the final product, which would be very often dyed cloth. So in Europe, by the way, this is going to play a very important role leading up to the Industrial Revolution. It doesn't quite play out that far in China, but it is interesting to consider that a similar kind of development was happening during this period, in some ways even kind of predating this development in Europe. Now, we might consider other aspects of Chinese society during this period. So for instance, very important within Chinese society, and as it had been for quite a while leading up to this time, is the social hierarchy, kind of the expectation that people know their place within the hierarchy. Very often is defined by a kind of religio-philosophical system known as Confucianism, very often defined by relationships, right? Where what defined your place in society and what told you how to behave was your position vis-a-vis someone else, right? Whether you were a son in relation to a father, a husband in relation to the wife, or in some ways more importantly, a wife in relation to the husband, so forth. Very high expectation that if you were in the lower position in that regard, that you should obey the other individual, right? And this definitely applied, for instance, to Chinese women who were expected to obey their parents, their husband, and then later on their son. And so there are many different manifestations of the kind of lower social status of women. Probably one of the most famous would have been the practice known as foot binding, though that really applied primarily to the upper classes. In large measure because, particularly as you go further down the line, imagine that you're a peasant woman. Even if in theory, ideally, you should be staying in the home, the fact of the matter is that your labor was probably required just for the subsistence of the family, and you really couldn't engage in any kind of productive activity if you had gone through this foot binding practice. I think most of you probably know what this involves. That they would that a woman at a very young age would be forced to wear very restrictive shoes that would prevent the feet from properly growing. By the way, this would very often result in the disfigurement of the feet. They, would remain ridiculously small. Many of the bones would be kind of cramped together and crushed. And kind of the idea that it made a woman look more attractive, in some ways kind of, symbolic of this idea that they should be demure and to some degree subservient to the male of the household. And in fact, women had very few rights within Chinese society during this period. So, very often they might have some say over household decisions, but, outside the household, particularly within the public sphere, they were expected to obey their father, husband, or son. And, they also had very limited property rights. So that would greatly inhibit their financial independence, as you might imagine. Now, in terms of government, quite a great deal of continuity with the Ming dynasty with respect to what preceded it. And in fact, this kind of defines the history of China up through the 20th century. You have, generally speaking, rather long-lasting dynasties that eventually come to an end. Perhaps a brief period of political fragmentation within China, but then eventually a new dynasty emerges that is able to reunite China. And for the most part, they pick up exactly where the previous dynasty left off, such that you have really little change in terms of the manner of government. Sometimes we refer to this period beginning with the Ming dynasty as the perfected late imperial system, kind of the idea that they had perfected the form of government that had prevailed for many centuries up until this point. So very hierarchical, very much in a sense resembling the kind of hierarchy that you find within the context of a family. The idea that one should be obedient to one's social superior, in this case, subject to emperor. All of this rooted in Confucian ideology, where the emperor has absolute authority, but by the way, is assisted by a very, very large, well-educated bureaucracy. And so kind of underpinning all of this, again, is this kind of religio-philosophical system known as Confucianism, right? So the Confucian view of society, very patriarchal. Within the household, the father has absolute authority. Within China, within the empire, the emperor, often presented as the son of heaven, though, by the way, heaven perceived more as this kind of unifying force of all reality, not as a place. The emperor, the son of heaven, the ruler, father of the empire, with absolute authority, but again, heavily assisted by a large bureaucracy. And I do want to just point out, like when we talk about bureaucracy in the context of Chinese government, you could go back to a very early point with respect to Chinese civilization. And this is in some ways one of the things that really distinguishes Chinese society, Chinese history, in comparison with most other parts of the world. During the pre-modern period, there are very few parts of the world where governments have very well-developed bureaucracies. China is in many ways the major exception in this regard. From a pretty early point, and certainly during the Ming dynasty, really very large, highly developed bureaucracies. And just to be clear, when we talk about bureaucracies, we're talking about the actual individuals who physically carry out government, right? I mean, so for instance, if you're talking about American society, if you're talking about American bureaucracies, you might be talking about, for instance, the Department of Motor Vehicles. You might be talking about the post office. You might be talking about the Department of Education. And probably most importantly, you would be talking about the Internal Revenue Service, because the most important bureaucratic structure or bureaucratic officials would be those dealing with the collection of taxes, right? Because it is the revenue derived to taxes that effectively pays for the entire bureaucracy. And again, I mean, today in modern societies, most modern governments have very well developed bureaucracies with large numbers of government officials who basically carry out the functions of government, right? These are the people who collect data, who ensure that people get the proper forms, that in order to carry out certain kinds of activities, whether it's getting a license that allows you to drive, it's about kind of regulating different kinds of activities. It could be you have bureaucratic structures related to how hospitals are run, how doctors conduct their business, and so forth. These are the people sitting behind desks who push papers around and pretty much make it all happen. Again, most importantly, those who actually collect taxes. And it was the same thing back in pre-modern China, but not really the same thing in most other parts of the world when we're looking at the pre-modern period. Now, within China, there was kind of an expectation that if you were a bureaucrat, you were highly educated, and the starting point for your education would have been Confucian philosophy, which had a lot to say in a practical sense about the actual carrying out of government, but also kind of reflected the idea that as a government official, you should be looking out for the welfare of the common people, right? So on the one hand, the common people should be respectful and deferent in their attitude towards you, but you had an obligation to look out for their welfare. And that a lot of that, how you understood that actually worked was rooted very much in Confucianism. Now, at the very top, of course, would have been the emperor, who made all important and even many unimportant decisions related to government. And if we're talking about the bureaucracy, you had different levels of bureaucracy, right? So you had at the very top what are known as grand secretaries, who would directly assist the emperor, both in providing information but also helping him to formulate policy, and who very often exercised considerable authority on behalf of the emperor. By the way, many of these were often eunuchs, and there's kind of an idea that as a eunuch, they were less inclined to have to be overly ambitious in a way that might threaten the authority of the emperor. And that was very important because in theory and to a very large extent in practice, government officials were completely devoted to the emperors, right? The emperor had absolute authority. Now, the emperor operated from the capital of Beijing, or more specifically from the Forbidden Palace, which was an immense palatial structure that was both his residence, but also the center of government, and designed in many ways as almost a kind of material form of propaganda of the power, strength, and authority of the emperor, right, to demonstrate his majesty. And so, for instance, if you were to actually enter the Forbidden Palace, you would have to go through a large number of courtyards and halls as you eventually progress stage by stage to the raised areas of the audience hall where you might actually approach him, right? And in a sense, creating this kind of process that you would feel a sense of awe as you made your way closer and closer to the emperor. It's a very formidable structure with massive outer and inner walls. When you finally got to the emperor would be on an elevated dais, sitting above his officials who would be kneeling before him. This was all very important in the sense of really projecting a feeling of strength, of security, the emperor, the son of heaven, who of course is also defender of the realm, and so forth. So this would all be kind of the public part of the Forbidden Palace. Behind the audience hall were the private chambers, and what we often refer to as the harem of the emperor. Harem in this case simply referring to, it's kind of this idea that this is a sacred precinct to which regular people would have, literally no access. Maybe even the highest ranking ministers, very limited access. But also effectively where the emperor could stop being emperor, right? Could let his hair down, in a sense could have kind of interpersonal exchanges with members of his family, among his, and there were large numbers of concubines. We often associate harems with large numbers of women, but also family members. So the kind of relationships also that could mean a certain degree of influence in the sense that you had kind of a much more personal relationship with him there. And so, in a sense, being emperor was actually a lot of work. It's, in a sense, whenever you were outside the harem, it was showtime. And you pretty much always had to represent the power, dignity, and authority of your position of the empire as a whole. And of course, the Forbidden Palace still exists. Today there are no emperors. As far as the actual governmental offices you would have found within the Forbidden Palace, right, we're talking about the upper echelons of government, the highest level of bureaucracy, which would have broken down into three main components. You would have had, kind of one body devoted to military affairs. You had the administrative branch, and very importantly, something known as a censorate, whose primary responsibility was to prevent corruption within the other two branches of government, right? To ensure that government officials were not behaving in a corrupt way, that they were looking out for the welfare of the people and so forth. And so, of course, they would have reported any wrongdoing to the emperor. But by the way, they also had the right to censor or to, basically point out to the emperor anything that he himself was doing wrong. Of course, that was always a bit dangerous, but in theory at least, in principle, they had that right and even you could say obligation. Beneath this upper level of administration were 6 ministries. So you have kind of this pyramid structure where, as you go further down towards the provincial, then prefectural, and then finally the district level, you have a growing number of institutions, but they would all answer to whichever administrative body was directly above them. And, again, being a bureaucrat or government official meant great prestige, particularly at the upper levels, a tremendous amount of power. But there really was a high expectation that you should be ethically committed to the welfare of the country and the people. By the way, just as a kind of aside, the term Mandarin, which many of us are familiar with, simply a Portuguese term or how they referred to these Chinese bureaucrats or government officials. A good question at this point might be, how did one become a bureaucrat? And so in theory, there really was this kind of idea that you should be highly educated and that you should have gone through an examination system in order to achieve the status of bureaucrat, right? And the competition to enter the civil service was intense, related to which, in order to provide the appropriate education in preparation for taking the exam, we would see, particularly during this period, a huge growth in the number of schools. There were different levels of bureaucracy, and so one might aspire to either a higher or lesser level of government, and that would determine the kind of education you received, but also the examination that you had to take. There were different examinations for each level of government. You had a county examination, provincial examination, and then at the highest level, the metropolitan examination. So this is how it worked in principle. To some degree, it also was a little bit about who you knew, that you came from the right background. Individuals coming from more wealthy elite families were more likely to become a bureaucrat. Of course, that also reflected the fact that, if for a wealthy family, it was much more feasible to send some, if not all, of your sons through the examination system, that they should be sent to school. Obviously, if you're coming from a peasant background, you might not have that luxury where you could afford to give up the labor of a son to have them enroll in a school, though it did happen. And on that subject, we should note that during this period, one very important social group, for a number of reasons, but including in the sense of providing individuals for the bureaucracy, would be what we often refer to as the gentry. Gentry are commoners, like regular folks, so they wouldn't, we're not talking about families that came from, among the wealthiest, most elite strata of society. Very often these are individuals who, in a sense, come from a peasant background, but who had achieved a certain level of wealth, very often constituted a kind of elite at a more local level, maybe coming from the village, or even maybe a larger town. So they end up kind of functioning as an intermediate layer between the elite bureaucracy, right, the individuals who would have made up the bureaucracy at the highest level of government, and actual peasants or villagers. So very often, they might, to some degree, they might actually constitute bureaucrats themselves, but probably operating at kind of the, at the highest level, at the level of a major town. Even, where they were not bureaucrats, very often they had a certain degree of influence at the district level, so they probably would have cooperated with the district magistrate. There was a tendency to, when appointing bureaucrats to positions at the level of the district, the idea that you should appoint an outsider because they would be less likely to be kind of influenced by local politics, that they would represent the authority of the emperor in a non-corrupt manner. But they, even if that was the case, they would very often have to cooperate with whoever were the important members of the gentry at that level. Now, many of the gentry, even if they still maintained very strong ties at the village level, would tend to live in more urban environments, either at, kind of within large towns or even within cities. But they would maintain a connection with the village they came from. Very often they were very important landlords, so what we call absentee landlords, because they weren't actually living on their estate in the village. They would rather live in the market towns or district seats, but you can be quite certain that they still maintained a tremendous amount of influence at the village level as well. So, the gentry, related to the fact that they would cooperate politically with district magistrates or bureaucrats, very often coming from a very similar social or educational background. So, kind of constituting collectively the same kind of social level, if you will, or grouping. And so, I mentioned that they kind of constituted they played this kind of intermediary role between elite bureaucrats and the people beneath them. In this respect, they both represented the authority of the imperial government when interacting with villagers, but in another sense, were expected to represent the interests of the villagers when interacting with district magistrates and so forth, right? So they kind of constituted a local leadership and expected to promote community interests. And we should know that very often they would be responsible for what we might call quasi-official functions at the very local level, right? The kind of responsibilities that the central government really didn't take on. This might be the maintaining of schools, of Confucian temples, the repairing of roads and bridges, and very often producing local histories. And by the way, the producing of histories, a very important function of bureaucrats as well, but at the higher level, they would have been writing histories of China as a whole, not local histories. I should note that if we're talking about the pre-modern period, China has produced more histories than any other civilization by far. For the Chinese, the writing of history was primarily for the purposes of providing guidance to present day governments, right, to current governments, depending on what time we're talking about, right? The idea that you can learn from your predecessors, either in terms of, kind of repeating what worked in the past or making sure not to repeat mistakes. Now, during this period, China is going to become the dominant power within all of East Asia. So, very often, this is a period beginning with the Ming dynasty, but it's really going to take off with the Qing dynasty, where large numbers of territories in Asia are being brought under direct Chinese control. But in many cases, territories would not be directly administered by China, but would come to constitute what we call tribute states, right? So we see the development of a tribute system. So in its own way, very imperialistic, but very often the type of control that they actually exercised with respect to these territories was somewhat indirect. And so kind of the way it worked is that these other territories would have their own governments, very often their own kings, but they were considered to be vassal kings who, in a sense, were expected, at least in theory, to defer to what was often referred to as the Middle Kingdom of China. Middle Kingdom in the sense that it's at the center. So the vassal kings would very often send ambassadors to the quote-unquote universal ruler of the Celestial Kingdom. Very often the ambassadors would arrive with embassies bringing gifts. And this would be a way of acknowledging the overlordship of China, though China wouldn't really interfere in how they manage their own kingdoms. But they would also at the same time legitimize the vassal kings by confirming their right to govern with seals, right? So, a lot of this is kind of symbolic, but it will also be, in a sense, reflective of China's cultural and political influence in these other states like, what eventually will come to constitute Korea, China, to some degree, various states in Southeast Asia, which are going to be heavily influenced by Chinese culture. In connection with these kinds of exchanges, very often these other kingdoms would send large numbers of young people to study in China. It was considered quite prestigious to become fluent in Chinese, to be able to write in Chinese characters and so forth. Confucianism would become adopted in many of these other states as kind of a basis for their own governments. So another example of Chinese influence. So in some ways, China defining the emergence of a kind of cohesive collection of civilizations that are all very strongly interlinked. Now, China during this period, particularly during the Ming dynasty, but then carrying over into the Qing dynasty, becoming very active to some degree globally, particularly in connection with trade. So I did mention that inter-regional trade is probably the most important component of trade overall, but China is actually, during this period, relatively active internationally to a much greater extent than Europe at this point. And so, part of this also reflected just a desire for, China to make its glory known to distant kingdoms, right? And if possible, to bring them into the tribute system, and that didn't always happen. But in connection with this, you see a lot of trade activity moving back and forth, and China becoming connected through trade, certainly with Southeast Asia, but also India, the Arabian Gulf, and even East Africa. And probably the early 15th century is kind of the high watermark for this kind of activity. China actually does kind of rein it in a bit from that point forward, and eventually to a much greater degree when we get to the Qing dynasty, in large measure because they just consider it to be too costly. But then later on, there's also kind of the idea of not wanting outside influences to corrupt Chinese culture and so forth. And by the way, in terms of what we know about, this period of trade and China's role in it, a very important source is a very particularly well-known figure in China, but even beyond, a eunuch named Zheng He, who was a Muslim, by the way, from Yunnan in China, who became very active in trading not only with the Middle East, but also with India and parts of Southeast Asia and Africa, and kept a record of many of his travels, right? So we know a lot about the sea routes, some aspects of trade during this period as it involved China, the kind of goods that were being transported. Here you can see a map kind of depicting the various travels of Zheng He. And you might imagine also, a lot of really cool stories connected with his travels that people would have been interested in reading about just for the adventure of it. And by the way, here we have an example of a typical Chinese merchant vessel from that period. And I'm not sure if it's entirely clear, but it's a really large vessel. It could have carried a tremendous amount of cargo, very seaworthy, as you might imagine, able to travel as far as East Africa and so forth. But again, eventually China's participation in global trade would diminish, but primarily on a voluntary basis. Now, one of the chief responsibilities of the Chinese government, of the emperor, was to defend the kingdom. The chief threat, particularly if we're looking at the period of the Ming dynasty, was the Mongols, who had established various kingdoms and even empires in some of the surrounding territory. The strategy adopted actually is pretty much the same one that they had used since the beginning of Chinese civilization, which was, first to try and make allies of whoever was just over the border, in this case the southern tribes, and then to direct their combative energies against those further afield, in this case the fearsome grassland Mongols. And part of the the reason this strategy often worked was that it prevented them from uniting in opposition to you, but sometimes it failed, right? Twice the Mongols did form confederations. Pretty much whenever they became united, they proved to be a very formidable threat. Were even able a number of times to defeat Chinese armies. For instance, in the 1430s, they captured the emperor, and in 1550 overran Beijing. Another threat that both the Ming and Qing would have to deal with was the threat of pirates. And so many of these were coming from Japan, or would align themselves with Japan. There were also Chinese pirates, and they would tend to make raids on the coast. So, I mean, they weren't threatening to overthrow either Ming or Qing power, but they obviously did create a lot of problems. The Chinese tried to deal with this by building defenses and using a scorched earth policy. Scorched earth policy means, basically destroying the value of any territory that they might be seeking to appropriate in some fashion, so there's really nothing for them to take, and nothing on the basis of which they might permanently establish themselves there. Probably the most serious threat in this vein was when Japan invaded Korea in 1592, and then again in 1597, 1598. And pirates were part of that as well. In any event, that now brings us to the Qing dynasty. And the transition is actually fairly smooth, relatively speaking. Kind of had more to do with a kind of question of succession, and making the long story short, it resulted in the establishment of a new dynasty, right? So the Ming dynasty ends in 1644. Almost immediately, the Qing dynasty begins. But what is very interesting about the Qing is that it corresponds to, from the point of view of people at that time, a non-Chinese people, ethnically speaking. The Manchus, based in Manchuria, who, by the way, had already established their rule in that region, were already partially Sinicized at the time of their conquest of China. Sinicize, simply a word to Sinicize, meaning to make more Chinese. Related to the same root that the word China comes from. In fact, in some languages, the word for China is Sin, as in Arabic, just to give an example. And the Manchus had actually been vassals of the Chinese. And even though adopting many Chinese customs, not least politically in terms of government and bureaucratically, were unique in some ways. So, for instance, in one respect, that they were different, organized by tribal units into what were known as commanderies. So, by the 16th century, they had become established under a single leader, had adopted Chinese forms of government, inclusive of, this kind of hierarchical structure consisting of 6 ministries and a censorate. And in fact, when they take over China, will present themselves as the conservative upholders of the Confucian order. So immediately accepting the supposed supremacy of Chinese forms of government, presenting themselves as guarantors of that, nonetheless will maintain this idea that they constitute a distinct ethnic identity, something that will be very much manifested in the manner in which they organize the military. And by the way, this idea of kind of defining distinct ethnic groups will extend beyond themselves and the Chinese. So, other peoples who come under their authority, territorially part of the Chinese Empire, their ethnic identities as somehow being non-Chinese or non-Han Chinese will be maintained as something distinct as well. Again, most prominently in the military, where basically it's organized into military units, each under a banner, each military unit taking the name of its flag, and defined in large measure on the basis of its ethnicity, where you end up with 8 Manchu banners, 8 Mongol banners, and 8 Chinese banners. The Manchu banners will actually have more companies than those of the other two. That is done literally for the purpose of maintaining the supremacy of the Manchu element. And so, particularly if you kind of group them together with their Mongol allies, they greatly outnumber Chinese troops by more than 2 to 1. So ethnic Chinese, in a sense, will have a diminished role within the Qing dynasty, and definitely within its military. And if you think about it, if you're trying to maintain the supremacy of one particular ethnic group, ensuring that they are the dominant element within the military would probably be a very effective means of doing that. And so this is going to also manifest itself in other ways. So, for instance, even the Chinese banners are very often dominated by ethnic Chinese coming from Manchuria. Manchu garrisons are segregated. So garrisons made up of Manchu soldiers, garrisons are fortresses where large numbers of troops would be stationed, will never be under the jurisdiction of Chinese officials. They operate independently. These, by the way, are given stipends and lands to cultivate, which is kind of further elevating their status, but now kind of extending that into society as a whole. And in order to maintain that distinction, once they are no longer operating within the confines of the military, they are forbidden to marry Chinese, and their children are expected to study Manchu, right? So they're kind of maintaining this Manchu identity even over generations. Now, nonetheless, over time, they will become more sinicized, and again, over many generations, ethnic distinctions will tend to be kind of washed out and become less important. But nonetheless, you can see there is actually a kind of concerted effort in order to maintain the primacy of the Manchu ethnic element. And by the way, here we see, kind of a artistic depiction from the period of the Qing dynasty of Manchurian soldiers, right? And their uniforms would have indicated their ethnic background. There are other ways in which the distinctiveness of the Manchu will be upheld. One very notable way and very visible is what's known as the Willow Palisade. So in 1688, they basically cordoned off northern and central Manchuria from the rest of China by creating a wall made up of willow trees, literally a willow palisade. Any territory north of that palisade is closed to Chinese immigrants. And they will try to maintain an important role for this Manchu element with respect to government as a whole. So, for instance, each post in the central government will see the appointment of two individuals. One who is ethnically Chinese, but they, who they feel assured about regarding their loyalty, and one who is Manchu. At the provisional level, Manchu governor generals will always oversee Chinese provincial government, just kind of making sure that there are no shenanigans of any kind. From that point downward, pretty much everything run by ethnic Chinese. Almost all district magistrates and officials, for instance, are Chinese. But as you might imagine, right, this is kind of fostering some tension between ethnic Chinese and Manchu. At this point, we might consider two really effective and very powerful Manchu rulers who, in a sense, are going to consolidate Manchu or Qing control of China. The first one is Kangxi, who reigns from 1661 until 1722, began his rule at the age of 13, and proved to be very effective, a real hands-on emperor, right? Not someone who just delegated authority or took the lead from his ministers, the highest level bureaucrats, but actually really, took a very active role in shaping policy. He's probably most famous for a lot of the important public works he carried out, including the diking of the Huai and Yellow Rivers and dredging of the Grand Canal, this very massive canal that connects different economic regions in China, which had already existed for some time, but now is going to be expanded and in some places repaired. He also, by the way, captured Taiwan in 1683, so for the first time becoming a part of China. He also did a lot to kind of promote China culturally. He was extremely well versed in the Confucian classics, directly presided over the palace examinations, and was a patron of scholarship. One very important literary work completed during his reign was the Ming history. So produced one of the definitive histories of the dynasty that preceded the Qing. And he was. This is a period of growing contact with Europeans. particularly Jesuits. He was very much intrigued by what they were relating to him about developments in European science and so forth. He himself studied with Jesuit astronomers. And this is a period where China is still somewhat open to foreign trade, right? So he opened 4 ports to foreign trade. Doing a lot to kind of really develop China, and in some ways, kind of solidifying Manchu control over China. Having said that, he himself greatly stressed Manchu identity. And in this vein, we might note that he built this marvelous summer palace on the plains of Manchuria. It's kind of the idea that, if as emperor you felt you were kind of losing connection with your roots, you might go spend some time there. It's kind of a similar practice existed among Mongol rulers when they conquered other territories, but kind of the idea of periodically returning to Mongolia. After him, we have Qianlong, who reigned from 1736 till 1795. This might be considered the high watermark of the Qing dynasty, a period of great prosperity. Much like his predecessor, a major patron of scholars, in some ways on an even grander scale. He's probably most famous for his 4 treasures of the classics. So kind of his attempt at consolidating the literary classics of Chinese and Confucian culture. And in connection with this, he actually employed over 15,000 copyists for almost 15 years in order to produce it. At the same time, he was not particularly open to any literary works that were critical of the Manchus. So he's also famous for carrying out a literary inquisition of such works, which basically meant trying to root them out and have them destroyed. We might conclude with his reign by noting that towards the end we had a problem of growing corruption. This led to a rebellion breaking out in 1796, which in the end the dynasty carried on. It was able to suppress it, but it did destabilize things a bit. It never fully recovered financially in terms of maintaining its tax base. But we have to be careful. It's not as if it went into some kind of steep decline. It's going to carry on until 1911. But never quite hitting the high marks that it did under Qianlong. Now I'd like to turn to one of the defining aspects of the Qing dynasty is that their rule is marked by a tremendous amount of territorial expansion, various peoples being brought under their control, being made part of the Chinese Empire. And so first of all, I should note this kind of corresponds to the upcoming assigned reading that we have in connection with this particular lecture. So related to this, we're also going to kind of see a shift in the manner of constructing Chinese national identity. Up until the Qing dynasty, largely understood as being defined in more or less ethnic terms, that being Chinese meant being Han Chinese, kind of meant that you're referring to peoples who had pretty much resided in territory corresponding to China under the Han Dynasty, which is going back quite a ways. So of course we already talked a bit about how the Qing Dynasty defined itself ethnically as being Manchu, not Han Chinese. But we're going to see kind of a retooling, shall we say, of Chinese national identity. And some of this corresponds to the growing pervasiveness of nationalist ideology during the 19th century. And we're going to be looking at that development later, in connection with kind of, what is nationalist ideology, something historians generally see as emerging out of Europe initially and then spreading to other parts of the globe. But in any event, we're going to see Chinese national identity redefined on a territorial basis, wherein it embraces and incorporates peoples who are not Han Chinese, who, at the time of their being absorbed into the Chinese Empire, would not have considered themselves Chinese, by any definition. So that is kind of a major kind of development taking place during the Qing Dynasty. Now, all this expansion is also going to bring them into conflict with other expanding empires, probably the most notable of which is Russia. Possibly the first major kind of conflictual encounter with the Russians was, kind of Russia was expanding eastward towards the Pacific. That was kind of bringing them into Manchuria. China, of course, considered Manchuria as being integral to its own empire. In the end, the Chinese were able to drive the Russians from the lower Amur River and then negotiate a treaty basically excluding Russia from northern Manchuria, even while permitting its caravans to travel through on the way to Beijing. That would be the Treaty of Nerchinsk. Really worth noting because in some ways kind of establishing respective spheres of influence that to some degree still define the relationship between Russia and China today. Having said that, Russia will remain the primary foreign threat with respect to China during this period. The Chinese under the Qing are also expanding westward, and this is going to bring them into conflict with the Mongols, and then eventually see them invade Tibet. At some point, they are kind of still contending with Russia, even with regards to some of these territories. So eventually they sign a new treaty with Russia in 1727, pretty much establishing these territories as falling within the Chinese sphere of influence. So altogether, they've brought about several millions of square miles of new territory under their control, much of which are designated as protectorates under a barbarian management office. And we should note that many of these territories that were conquered by the Manchu have come to define what for many Chinese, even until today, constitute China's proper borders. And this even includes some territories that have since been lost, and certainly many non-Chinese peoples. So just to kind of summarize and give an idea about what territories we're talking about, you can see, some of what's here, which today now constitutes a part of the state of China, including Tibet, which is kind of roughly corresponding to where you see the Himalayas, and then you have territories even further west, including, for instance, the Uyghur people, who are predominantly Muslim, but neither peoples who defining themselves as being Chinese, and some challenging the idea that they are even nationalistically speaking Chinese. So at this point, I want to talk a little bit about what early on is probably the chief form of interaction between China and Europe. And this is primarily through the channel of Christian missionaries, initially primarily Jesuits, who become fairly active in East Asia. And we kind of briefly talked about this when we were looking at the Counter-Reformation, corresponding to chapter 16. So you have Jesuits who are operating in China, and in part in order to better present their evangelical message regarding the Christian faith, adopt local customs, and eventually even come in some cases to hold an important position in the emperor's court. So initially they're actually pretty careful about what position they take with respect to Chinese cultural practices, or even what might be deemed religious practices. They do attack Taoism and Buddhism, but they're very careful in terms of how they address Confucianism. In fact, they even kind of argue that it's very complementary to Christian values, and in particular are careful not to ruffle any feathers regarding the worship of ancestors, which is a very common practice among Chinese people at this point, particularly if we're talking about just regular folk. And so, initially the Jesuits are actually going to make some headway as far as converting people to the Christian faith. Under Kangxi, actually, they're able to operate somewhat freely. He's very sympathetic to the Jesuits, really not because of their religious beliefs, but very often they become kind of the conduit for learning about new technological developments in Europe, and he's very much fascinated by this. But at some point, Christianity is going to fall out of favor, in large measure because of decisions made by the Pope, who in the mid-18th century declares that Chinese Christians could not participate in the family rites of ancestor worship. And that is seen as a direct attack on Chinese culture, on cultural values, and so forth, and ends up leading the emperor to decide to ban the Christian faith in China. And in some ways, this, the banning of Christianity, part of a kind of broader growing resistance to Western, particularly European influence. So that's going to manifest itself also in an attempt to regulate and control trade with Europe, which eventually becomes restricted to one port, Guangzhou, also known as Canton. And in fact, I mean, it's not even just that city. Europeans are barred from entering the city proper. A specific territory outside the city, outside its walls along the river, is assigned specifically for European trading activity. Europeans are not permitted to actually operate outside that territory. Additionally, even in that territory, they're subject to the control of official merchant guilds and Chinese law. And so around this time, actually, this is really going to some degree, hinder trade with Europe. There's really the only European power that is profiting from trade with China at this point are the English, primarily in connection with tea and silk. Eventually, one or another of the European powers are going to start becoming more active in terms of trade. Probably after the English, the Portuguese are going to be very important in this respect. They're going to arrive at a similar kind of arrangement, but it's actually going to correspond to a different territory, a tiny peninsula at Macau that was walled off from China. Right, so within that territory, the Portuguese are allowed to operate. That eventually actually becomes the city of Macau, which for much of its history is a Portuguese colony. As you can see in the image on the top there, today a very large city. I actually had the pleasure of visiting it. It's kind of the, dare I say, the Vegas of China. So as part of the Chinese state now, no longer a Portuguese colony, obviously, it does enjoy a certain kind of semi-autonomous status. But it did start out as a Portuguese colony. And then after the Portuguese, we're going to start to see other trading actors coming from Europe. Very important is going to be the British East India Company, which begins operating in China in 1699. Later on, the Americans in 1784. But at this point, in some ways, it reflects more that the European powers and to some degree the United States are putting pressure on the Chinese government, compelling them to allow them to operate in some fashion in trading with China. Now all of this, right, the banning of Christianity, this kind of restriction of trade with the West, in some ways part of a broader trend developing, particularly towards the latter part of the Qing dynasty, of resisting outside influences and kind of turning inwards culturally, right? Almost this kind of idea of preserving the purity of Chinese culture. So, within that context, there are some important developments. But a lot of this kind of reflects also a growing sensibility that really the only culture that matters are cultures that have long traditions within Chinese society. And this actually goes back even to the Ming dynasty. And so, any kind of traditional category of literature, art, activities often associated with scholar bureaucrats, people who've had a Confucian education, come to constitute a kind of what very often today we refer to as high culture. Probably maybe the most important kind of development in terms of something new is the evolution of Confucianism into what today we refer to as Neo-Confucianism, which reflects the growing influence of Taoism and Buddhism on Confucius thought, where it's even starting to feel a little bit more like a religion. This very kind of spiritual aspect to it. Probably the most important individual in connection with that would be Zhu Xi. And it's also evident in the kind of goods that are starting to be produced, or at least where there's a focus. For instance, this is exceptionally evident in the production of porcelain, right? Like at some point you have a very defined notion about what constitutes What are like appropriate designs and patterns and so forth for porcelain. I should know porcelain, a highly desired commodity in most of the world, particularly in Europe, because for a long time only the Chinese know how to actually manufacture it. Eventually, Europeans kind of work it out and develop their own pottery industry imitative of Chinese porcelain wares. But I mean, the Chinese porcelain still kind of constitutes the ideal of what these kinds of wares should look like. And finally, we might conclude our discussion of cultural developments with the beginnings of the novel in China. The novel, right, this kind of is a particular category of literature, actually a very modern category in all parts of the world. In China, kind of having its own kind of developing in a sense independent of what's happening elsewhere. It's growing out of what are known as plot books, used by earlier storytellers, where they would take a lot of individual smaller stories and find a way to string them together, but very often in a way where they're only very loosely connected. And what's kind of interesting with the development of the novel in China, usually these were written by scholars who had failed the examinations and therefore were not able to achieve a position in the bureaucracy. Right? So in order to make a livelihood, they took to writing these novels, usually in the not so respectable colloquial Chinese, right? The Chinese just used by regular folk in their day-to-day conversations, which certainly would not have been considered appropriate for any kind of serious scholarly writing, such as might be done by a scholar bureaucrat, someone who was a member of the bureaucracy. And in fact, not just in terms of style, but also content, they were designed to appeal to regular folk. Many were pornographic, for instance. A good example would be The Golden Lotus, about the sexual adventures of an urban merchant. And certainly the political elite under the Qing dynasty not happy about this kind of literature, which was very popular and very pervasive. So they actually actively tried to suppress it. Though later on there was kind of a reappraisal of this kind of literature as maybe something authentically Chinese, this kind of rediscovery of this tradition of the novel, and they became quite popular again. I mean, they always were popular, but it was more acceptable to actually read them. And finally, we might, if we're going to talk about the Chinese novel, we should definitely mention what is probably the most popular one, maybe the most well-known traditional Chinese novel, a book by the title of All Men Are Brothers, sometimes known as The Water Margin. And by the way, a really good example of how you might take all these individual short stories and string them together to create a novel. In this case, various stories about different bandit heroes, but then you kind of come up with this overarching framework, that these bandit heroes are living together in a hideout on a mountain surrounded by marshes, and that they're all driven by a similar purpose: to avenge the wrongs perpetrated by corrupt officials. And in fact, there's exactly 108 of them. In some ways would feel like a weird fusion of the A-Team and Robin Hood. But probably a lot of the stories pertaining to individual bandit heroes originally had developed independently of one another, but here they're all kind of strung together. And just to conclude, I mean, their main purpose is to entertain, right? They're very funny stories about daring adventures and so on. So we're going to conclude our discussion of developments in China right here. And this also marks the end of part 1 of our lecture. Part 2 will be picking up with concurrent developments in Japan.